All right, how we doing, folks? Today is the 5th of August, and this is episode number 5 of WarTrackerTV. I'm your host, Matt. The purpose of WarTrackerTV is to bring awareness to any and all conflicts and wars happening across the globe. We'll learn about different groups of people, countries, governments, religions, and any other factors contributing to these events. I'm an expert on nothing, and I'm merely here to help facilitate the learning of these topics. All news articles, documents, and Google Earth projects will be made available after the broadcast on my X profile at x.com/WarTrackerTV. And YouTube will serve as the permanent platform for all previous episodes. No, unfortunately, that's not me playing Machine Gun. How you doing today, brother? That is actually Alex Holycross from the Native Howl. He gifted me with 20, 30 scratch tracks, some demo songs he was working on. And that song is actually a 15-minute long epic that he's been putting together. So I figure I'll wait a few more months, and I might ask him if he's got a second draft of that one, because I really love what he's doing with that song. All right. Anyways, today we'll be talking about Gaza. Right now, you got kind of two opposite things happening at the same time. On one end, you have the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, saying they are pretty much going to be gunning for a full occupation of Gaza, extended occupation, it sounds like. Something maybe similar to what the United States was doing in Iraq and Afghanistan, perhaps. But more to come on that. On the opposite end, you've got 600 former Israeli senior security officials who basically wrote and signed a collective letter to Donald Trump, President of the United States, urging him to urge Netanyahu to end the war in Gaza. So we'll be digging into that for a little bit. After that, we got Ukraine. Right now, NATO is coordinating regular and large-scale arm purchases for Ukraine. And most, if not all of those, are coming from the United States of America. On top of that, also, Reuters come out with an article. Pretty much, they got some sources saying that Putin essentially doubts what Trump's ultimatum at the end of this week is going to accomplish, if anything. So we'll read a little bit about that. More kind of political stuff with Ukraine today. It didn't seem like there was a whole heck of a lot of updates on the, on the war front there. Not much changed over the last 24 hours that I could find. After Ukraine, we're going to be digging into Sudan a bunch more than we did yesterday. We're going to try to figure out who the RSF are, what this war, this third civil war in Sudan over the last 80 years is about. We're going to dig into that for a little bit, and then we'll end with a little bit of talk on Hezbollah in Lebanon and what the government out there is doing. All right. So first on to Gaza. So this just came out in the last couple hours. Netanyahu is proposing a full reoccupation of Gaza. So we'll see what we can figure out his plan is from the starts here. I don't think all of this has been quite announced yet. It's kind of like a preliminary announcement, it seems. So here we go. Netanyahu is to propose fully reoccupying the Gaza Strip when he meets his security cabinet. The media in Israel is saying the die has been cast. We're going for the full conquest of the Gaza Strip and defeating Hamas. Local journalist, quote, a senior official is saying. Respondents to reports that the army chief and other military leaders opposed the plan. The unnamed official said if that doesn't work for the chief of staff, he should resign. So basically, if you're not on board and you work for the Israeli government, you should get out of the way, they're saying. The family of hostages fears such plans would endanger their loved ones, with about 20 out of 50 believed to be alive in Gaza, while polls suggest 3 in 4 Israelis instead favor a ceasefire deal to return them. That's interesting. 3 out of 4 Israelis would prefer a ceasefire. Very interesting. Oh, my daily kickbot has arrived. Let's go ahead and get rid of that real quick. All right. Many of Israel's close allies would also condemn such a move as they push for an end to the war and action to alleviate a humanitarian crisis. Within Israel, hundreds of retired Israeli security officials, including former heads of intelligence agencies, issued a joint letter to U.S. President Donald Trump on Monday, calling for him to pressure Netanyahu to end the war. And so I've got another article I'll bring up about that letter. It was something like 600 retired Israeli security officials. So it is a pretty significant thing when they do those kind of collective letters like that, urging politicians to take action. Those things are really hard to ignore. One of the signatories, ex-domestic intelligence agency chief Ayalon, told the BBC that further military action would be futile. From the military point of view, Hamas is totally destroyed. On the other hand, as an ideology, it is getting more and more power among the Palestinian people within the Arab street around us and also in the world of Islam. So he's saying that Hamas is totally defeated militarily. However, people are starting to latch on to them, probably, as blowback from some of the things we're seeing out of Gaza. So the only way to defeat Hamas's ideology is to present a better future. So, that's obviously one very easy thing to say, a little harder to do, especially in this situation. I think it's still pretty unanimous in Israel that they all want to see the defeat of Hamas. I don't think they've wavered at all in that, but it seems like they just say it was 3/4 of people are hoping for a ceasefire in hopes of that resulting in the release of the last hostages. Latest developments come after indirect talks with Hamas on a ceasefire and hostage deal broke down, and Palestinian armed groups released 3 videos of 2 Israeli hostages looking weak and emaciated. The footage of Ram Blazlovsky and Aviator David, both kidnapped from the Nova Music Festival. Okay, so they were both. Those weren't. Okay, I thought those might have been former IDF soldiers. But it looks like they were actually at that music festival. So there was a festival going on that morning of October 7th, and that was one of the main places that they, did part of their massacres and then, retrieved some hostages and stuff, captives that they've since had for almost 2 years now. David is shown digging what he says is his own grave in an underground tunnel. There's been some speculation that the latest media announcements are a pressure tactic to try and force Hamas into a new deal. Israel's military says it has already occupied 75% of Gaza, but under the proposed plan, it would occupy the entire territory, moving into areas where more than 2 million Palestinians are now concentrated. So moving your military into small strips of land where 2 million essentially refugees are is kind of a recipe for disaster, potentially. It is unclear what that would mean for those civilians and for the operations of the United Nations and other aid groups. About 90% of Gaza's 2.1 million people have been displaced, so pretty much almost all of them. 90% of 2.1 million, that's 1.8, 1.9 million people essentially are refugees. Some repeatedly, and are living in overcrowded and dire conditions. Humanitarian groups and UN officials say many are starving, accusing Israel of impeding the distribution of crucial aid. Israel, meanwhile, says it will allow local business people in Gaza to restart entry of some goods as part of efforts to improve conditions there. Approved items include baby food, fruit and vegetables, and hygiene products. Private imports were previously stopped because of claims that Hamas was benefiting. The Israeli military has previously held back from taking over some areas of Gaza, including central parts, because of the assumption that there are living hostages held there. Okay. So they've basically taken over pretty much all of Gaza, except for some of the parts that they think there are hostages around. So last year, 6 Israeli hostages were executed by their captors after ground forces moved in. So that's their fear right now with the hostages and their ground strategy is that if they move into that last quarter or so of Gaza, that those last 20-ish remaining still living captives would be then executed. There has not been a formal response, but officials from the Palestinian Authority, which governs parts of the occupied West Bank, denounced the Israeli proposal, calling on the international community to intervene to prevent any new military occupation. Palestinians point out that far-right Israeli ministers have been openly advocating for the full occupation and annexation of Gaza and ultimately want to build new Jewish settlements there. In 2005, Israel dismantled settlements in the Gaza Strip and withdrew its forces from there. But alongside Egypt, it maintained tight control of access to the territory. So, of course, Egypt's on this kind of southwest border, and then Israel. So I guess I've always thought Gaza was just part of Israel, but I don't know. Is it? Obviously, it's not a country, and it's not Palestine. It's not the country of Gaza. So it's kind of overlapping areas under Israeli military control or subject to evacuation orders. So it's kind of just not clear totally what that land is, where it belongs now, so to speak. All right. The new occupation idea comes amid growing international moves to revive the two-state solution, the long-time international formula to resolve the decades-old Israel-Palestinian conflict. It envisages an independent Palestinian state being created alongside Israel in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, with East Jerusalem as its capital. So we'll look real quick here on the map. Now, Jerusalem's right here. So what they're saying is the east side, which would be this side, the old city, would be the capital of this new potential state of Palestine, which would be the West Bank, which is this section, and then Gaza, which is this section. And then, of course, you have Israel cutting right in between it. So how viable of a long-term solution is that? To have one country split in two by another? I don't know. I don't know how long that would work. I feel like that would make people happy for a little while, but it probably, I don't know if that's 50 years from now. Are people still going to be cool with that? I don't know. Last week, the UK and Canada joined France in announcing conditional plans for recognizing a Palestinian state. So you've got some pretty major countries. And then, of course, Saudi Arabia was at the table of the UN kind of helping foster the reignition of these conversations of the two-state solution. That's very important because, Palestinians are going to need Arab allies and Muslim countries that support them in order to, make this work. And to have Saudi Arabian support in Palestine, it's a big deal because, the Saudi Arabians and the Iranians, they are bitter enemies. They're both conflicting ideologies of Islam. One's Shia, one's Sunni. So if the Palestinians can muster support from the Saudis, who are Sunni, it could potentially help get some of the crazy Shia folks out of there, Hamas and stuff, because Saudi Arabia is just as dedicated to the destruction of Hamas as Israel in a lot of ways. Although, even though Hamas isn't so much focused on Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabia is more so dealing with, Yemen and the Houthis down here on the south side. This is more what they have to deal with. Whereas Hamas, they're more focused on Israel. And then you've got Hezbollah, of course, up on the north side of Israel, also focused on them. All right. The Israeli prime minister is now expected to meet with key ministers and military leaders to decide next steps in Gaza. Israeli army radio says they are due to discuss initial army plans to surround the central refugee camps and carry out airstrikes and ground raids. Wow. So they're going to surround refugee camps, presumably to cordon those people inside the camps so that they can carry out the airstrikes without having to worry about civilian deaths. Potentially, maybe, is the strategy behind that. Netanyahu said he would convene a full security cabinet meeting this week. Israeli media commentators have voiced skepticism and drawn attention to the practical military, political, and diplomatic challenges. Yes, this sounds very, very difficult to pull off. Writing in the Yedioth Aronoth newspaper, Barnea says Netanyahu has never taken a gamble on this scale before. He notes that the Israeli PM has repeated his vow to achieve all of his war goals, but after 22 months of bloody fighting, it is hard to take those kinds of promises seriously. It seems that Netanyahu has just one objective in the war in Gaza, and that's to prolong the war. Israel launched its military offensive in Gaza in response to Hamas's attack on October 7th, in which 1,200 people were killed, 251 taken as hostage. And the Hamas-run health ministry says that at least 61,020 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli forces. All right. So on one end, you've got that going on, and then on the other end, let's dig into this this letter that came from a bunch of former Israeli security officials. And this, of course, this is from Al Jazeera, who they definitely lean pro-Palestinian. So keep that in mind. But I think it is very important to kind of acknowledge this letter, especially considering they're begging the president of the United States to intervene and stop this war, which kind of says a lot about where they feel. I feel like they think they can't get through to Netanyahu at this point, which that last article definitely kind of paints the same picture. The group's letter says the Israeli army has already achieved its objectives and the release of Israeli captives can be achieved only through a deal. More than 600 former Israeli senior officials have urged United States President Donald Trump to bring an end to the war on Gaza as deaths of dozens of Palestinians from Israeli-induced starvation have caused global outrage. The appeal was made in a letter sent to Trump on Sunday. Its signatories include former Mossad chief Pardo, former Shin Bet chief Ayalon, former deputy Israeli army chief Vilnay. They called for pressure on Netanyahu to end the nearly 2-year conflict, which has devastated Gaza. The letter was sent as a furor grows over videos released by Palestinian groups showing 2 emaciated Israeli captives in Gaza, where more than 2 million Palestinians are also struggling to survive a starvation crisis. Everything that could be achieved by force has been achieved. The hostages cannot wait any longer. The commanders for Israeli security group said that's the CIS, on a post in X where the letter was shared, and we're going to read that letter in a second here. The letter said that the Israeli army had achieved 2 of its 3 objectives by force, dismantling Hamas's military formations and governments, but the third, bringing back all Israeli captives, can only be achieved through a deal. Stop the Gaza war on behalf of CIS. That's a quote. You did it in Lebanon. Now it's time to do it in Gaza. All right. So let's read this letter real quick. So this, of course, is addressed to President Trump and the White House. Dear Mr. President, stop the Gaza war. On behalf of CIS, Israel's largest group of former IDF generals in Mossad, Shin Bet, police, and diplomatic corps equivalents, we urge you to end the Gaza war. You did it in Lebanon. It's time to do it in Gaza as well. The IDF has long accomplished the 2 objectives that could be achieved by force, dismantling Hamas's military formations and governance. The third, the most important, can only be achieved through a deal, which is bringing home all the hostages. It is our professional judgment that Hamas no longer poses a strategic threat to Israel, and our experience tells us that Israel has all it takes to deal with its residual terror capabilities, remotely or otherwise. It's a strong statement. Changing remaining senior Hamas operatives can be done later, or chasing remaining Hamas operatives can be done later. Our hostages cannot wait. Your credibility with the vast majority of Israelis augments your ability to steer Prime Minister Netanyahu and his government in the right direction. In the war, return the hostages, stop the suffering, and forge a regional international coalition that helps the Palestinian Authority, once reformed, to offer Gazans and all Palestinians an alternative to Hamas and its vicious ideology. So then it's signed by 5 different people who probably, have the most collective rank amongst them, amongst the 600-ish members. But presumably, this what follows this letter is a bunch of signatures. So very interesting. I think that's obviously a pretty big development in all of this. So I'm assuming they're sending Trump a letter because they've already solicited their own prime minister. Yeah, I can only assume that they've either already tried that or they're at the conclusion that Netanyahu will not be swayed, because like the first article that we read was that Netanyahu is proposing a full reoccupation of Gaza. So it seems like he has made up his mind at this point. The state media in Israel is quoting a lot of high-ranking officials, basically saying if you're not on board with us, then get out of the way. More or less is what they're saying. So yeah, I feel like they probably sent this to Netanyahu and it just fell on deaf ears, and now they're making their pleading their case to President Trump. Obviously, the United States has a lot of say in what happens in Gaza because we are the primary funding force of the Israeli military. Um, in terms of dollars and equipment and all that stuff. I mean, for decades now, the United States and Israel have been extremely close allies. I don't think we've ever really had much of a rift or a downturn with Israel where there was like a period of time where, we weren't talking or anything. So, these 600 people, obviously, they all served decades, presumably, in the Israeli government. They understand the importance and the significance of the United States' role in all of this. And I think that they've come to the conclusion that the only way they can stop further occupation is by pleading with Donald Trump. So that kind of says a lot in regards to where they're at right now. Um, And when I read that letter, it's hard to disagree with it because you look at these photos of Gaza, the few that have actually been able to leak out, and it's very clear and apparent that it's virtually completely destroyed. I mean, we know that Hamas has an extensive underground tunnel network. Um, However, that's also where these hostages are being held. And in the past, when they tried entering these tunnels, what happens is Hamas just executes whoever's still left out of those hostages. So it said earlier there were some 6, I think, Israeli hostages that were executed in earlier months ago, when IDF forces were closing in on their location. So these guys are saying we've done everything we can do militarily. We've completely wiped out the governance and the military capabilities of Hamas. So those were 2 of the 3 objectives: was destroy Hamas's government imprint or footprint in Palestine, which these guys are all saying they've achieved that, and then also destroy them militarily, which they are also saying they've achieved that. And I know on the other side with Israel, they have lost hundreds of soldiers in this war. Let me see how many. IDF soldiers have been killed. So I've read this. There's been hundreds of them. Let's see. There were 558 in 2023 and 363 in 2024, plus whatever's happened in 2025. And on top of that, they're having, and this is very sad. And as a former United States soldier, it's just something all of us Middle East vets have dealt with our friends and stuff. But now they're starting to have a suicide epidemic in the IDF. A lot of officers are taking their own lives. Veterans of Gaza are taking their own lives because of the things they've seen and done. Presumably in Gaza during this conflict. So the Israeli military is feeling the effects of this conflict, and I think these senior officials, when you're in the military and you're a commander and you're, trying to get that next rank and all that stuff, you're always going to push your soldiers and stuff. But I think when you retire and you reflect back on some of those moments, you start to see that, maybe you went a little too hard at times. And I think these retired officials are kind of assessing the situation overall. And when they say we've achieved all our military objectives, there's nothing else we can do. What they're saying is we've destroyed Gaza completely, just about. And what do we still have people out there for? This is a question I had. I was in Afghanistan when SEAL Team 6 got bin Laden. And I was like, so what are we still here for then? Wasn't that the mission? But of course, that was in May of 2011, and we didn't leave until August of 2021. So another 10 years went by. And that was 10 more years of, putting people out there and just for us to leave. And that's the thing is you got to think of the long-term impacts on your country, on your military, on the individuals that served in the military. And Israel is going to be having a lot of issues with these folks that have served in this conflict because of some of the things that they've seen and how many of their own friends that have died. And then all of the, just the humanitarian aspect of what they're seeing happen to the Palestinian people. And, if they're out there to destroy Hamas and stuff, but when you see women suffering and you see children suffering, you see all that stuff, it takes you got to be a very different kind of person to see that and have it not affect you, even if you are in enemy territory. So I think that, that's something that the IDF is going to have to consider. And the United States of America did not consider that stuff when we had a 20-year-long war in Afghanistan, and we had an 8-year-long war in Iraq, and then a bunch more kind of minor things that happened in Iraq that we kept sending people to for afterwards. And the cost is huge on the country. The long-term cost, how many people we have on disability now because of these conflicts. We got millions and millions of veterans now who have a variety of issues, physical, mental, spiritual, and all this stuff is going to, Israel's going to be dealing with this for decades. And the thing is, they've destroyed Gaza so completely that they're not only going to have to deal with their own problems, but also, those lands and the people from those lands, they're not going to forget this stuff. So I think when these senior officials are starting to urge President Trump, they're starting to think of all these long-term impacts of what this war is going to do in that area. Even if you do get a Palestine out of this, are those people going to, just start smiling and magically be happy because they have a country now? No, their country's destroyed. I guess I don't understand how the prime minister is still in position, has not been voted out. Yeah. I want to say we were talking about Putin yesterday and how he was in office, he left, and then he came back. I thought that happened with Netanyahu too. Let's look this up real quick. Netanyahu, PM history. Let's see. All right, so here we go. Benjamin Netanyahu is an Israeli politician and diplomat. He served as Prime Minister of Israel since 2022. He was previously in office from 96 to 99 and from 2009 to 2021. And he's the longest serving prime minister. Interesting. So he's actually held this office 3 times now, from 96 to 99, then from 09 to 21, June of 21, and then from December of 22 to the present. Interesting. So he's been in and out quite a bit. I know, I'm pretty sure he was IDF as well, if I remember right. But yeah, it's really interesting. He's been in and out. This is his 3rd time as prime minister, it looks like. So yeah, I mean, the Israeli people at times have gone with somebody else, presumably, or he had to step down for one reason. I don't know the history of all those instances, but I did remember he's been on and off as their leader. So that's interesting. I mean, 3 of the biggest players in the world right now are Trump, Putin, and Netanyahu, and all 3 of them have had non-continuous service where they've had to leave and then came back, either got voted out, or I think it said Putin had an 8-year term limit or something his first time around, but I think he's been in longer than that now. So I don't know. He's more of a dictator now, I guess you'd say. And then of course we read up a little bit on Medvedev or whatever his name is yesterday. He was kind of the president in between Putin's terms, but yeah, weird stuff. All these leaders who they don't hold or they don't maintain their hold on power. They lose it and then they come back. And then now we're talking about a bunch of messes that are going on in the world. All right. Well, there you have it. That's Gaza for the day. Not much else to say on that. We're going to keep seeing what develops out of that. We're going to hear more about Netanyahu's plans here, what exactly this full-on reoccupation of Gaza entails, and are they going to get their hostages back if they do that? I mean, they're publicly claiming that they're going to do this. Well, simultaneously, these news articles are saying the reason they haven't done it is because they fear that those hostages are going to be executed, as others have been once they close in. So I don't know. We'll see what Netanyahu decides to do. I can tell you this. If those hostages don't make it home, he's done in Israel. I don't think it matters what happens in Gaza. If those hostages don't make it home, Netanyahu's time as Israeli prime minister will be done soon. So I don't know. He's a full reoccupation might not be compatible with getting all those hostages back. And yeah, it's going to be pretty bad for him if he doesn't. Anyways, moving on to Ukraine. All right. So this is going to be important. This little piece of information here. NATO is coordinating regular and large-scale arm deliveries to Ukraine. Most will be bought in the U.S. So the U.S. is going to be selling a lot of large-scale armaments to NATO, who is then going to take those and give them to the Ukrainians. So on one hand, we have Trump's ultimatum, which is the 8th of August in a couple days here, coming up, where he wants this war to have stopped by them or else things are going to happen. And while that's happening, NATO is coordinating more and more supplies to Ukraine. So NATO's ramping up as if nothing's going to happen with those threats, or nothing's going to happen in terms of scaring Russia into, submitting, so to speak. NATO started coordinating regular deliveries of large weapons packages to Ukraine after the Netherlands said it would provide air defense equipment, ammunition, and other military aid worth €500 million. Sweden also announced Tuesday it would contribute $275 million to a joint effort along with its Nordic neighbors Denmark and Norway to provide $500 million worth of air defenses, anti-tank weapons, ammunition, and spare parts. Okay, that's interesting. This some of these Nordic countries, getting in. Norway, Sweden, Denmark. What about Finland? Where's Finland? No Finland. You would think Finland would be part of this. You know, Finland was invaded by the Russians in World War II. I'm sure they haven't forgotten. Sure, they haven't forgotten. 2 deliveries of equipment, most of it bought in the United States, are expected this month, although the Nordic package is expected to arrive in September. Okay, so stuff is on the way. They're going to get some stuff this month, and then next month they're going to get a bunch of stuff from these Nordic countries. Now, presumably that equipment is coming directly from them and not being funneled through them by the United States. Seems like NATO's kind of handling United States shipments, so to speak, and then these countries are kind of doing their own thing with their own gear. Air defenses, anti-tank weapons, ammunition, spare parts. Yeah, okay. The equipment is supplied based on Ukraine's priority needs on the battlefield. NATO allies then locate the weapons and ammunition and send them on. Oh, there you go. So Ukraine is saying, hey, we need X, Y, and Z, and NATO is saying, all right, we will find that for you. Packages will be prepared rapidly and issued on a regular basis, NATO said on Monday. Air defense systems are in the greatest need. The United Nations has said that Russia's relentless pounding of urban areas behind the front line has killed more than 12,000 Ukrainian civilians. So that is a pretty significant number because, you know, Ukraine was able to evacuate a lot of people. Jeez. These kickbots are just ruthless, man. Absolutely ruthless. They just don't stop. Anyways, Ukraine was able to get a lot of their people out through their western border nations. Now, obviously, people are going to choose to stay. Generally speaking, it's going to be elderly people that choose to stay. They don't want to leave their homes, especially towards the end of their lives. And I think they feel like, hey, if I'm killed by a Russian bomb, who cares? I think, unfortunately, that's kind of how some of the older people in this area, they're a little hard-headed. And besides, this area of the world, man, these Slavic countries, I mean, there has just been so much war and destruction in this region of the of Europe, of Eastern Europe, and kind of Westernish Asia. I know that the Ural Mountains kind of separate. Where are the Ural Mountains? Maybe here. I'm not sure, but anyways, that's what separates the Asian and European continents. But nonetheless, people who live in these areas, I think they know their history, and they kind of feel like, hey, I'm a Ukrainian or whatever. This is where I live. This is where I'm from. This is where I'm staying. It's where I will die, kind of thing. So that's why there has been 12,000 Ukrainian civilians killed. There's always going to be people that stay behind. And then, of course, you've got the the first responders and all that stuff that are trying to help every time these missiles strike, put the fires out and all that stuff. Russia's bigger army is also making slow but costly progress along the 1,000-kilometer front line. Currently, it is waging an operation to take the eastern city of Pokrovsk, a logistical hub whose fall could allow it to drive deeper into Ukraine. So the Russia's still advancing along their 600-some mile front line. And they're trying to take Pokrovsk right now. So let's go find that. Here we go. So this is in Donetsk, formerly Donetsk Oblast. Okay. So we'll drop a pin here. This is heavy fighting. Russians advancing. I know I've seen multiple reports that the Russians have been capturing some villages and stuff lately. Whereas for a long time, it was pretty stagnant. But I think, the Ukrainian manpower issue is really starting to rear its head. There's something like, I've done this before, but there's like 7 or 8, I think, Russians for every one Ukrainian, just population wise. So, obviously, I mean, everyone knows Russia is a much larger country, but population wise, it also is significantly larger than Ukraine. Russia's bigger army is also making the slow progress. All right. European allies and Canada are buying most of the equipment they plan to send from the United States, which has greater stocks of ready military material as well as more effective weapons. The Trump administration is not giving any arms to Ukraine. Okay. So the United States isn't directly giving weapons to Ukraine. Now I guess we're just selling it to NATO and then they're giving it to Ukraine. The new deliveries will come on top of other pledges of military equipment. The Kiel Institute, which tracks support for Ukraine, estimates that as of June, European countries have provided 72 billion euros worth of military aid since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion in February 22, compared with $65 billion in U.S. aid. So there you have it. So all of Europe has given about $83 billion and the United States has given about $65 billion. I know President Trump had said something like $130 billion, and that was pretty much immediately disputed by a lot of different people. And then I don't think Trump ever followed up with how he came up with that $130 billion number. But now, on top of this, I think there's going to be what NATO is providing in weapons, which is going to be a whole new category here in Ukraine. Dutch Defense Minister Breckelman said that American air defense systems and munitions in particular are crucial for Ukraine to defend itself. Announcing the deliveries Monday, he said Russia's attacks are pure terror intended to break Ukraine. President Zelensky expressed his gratitude to the Netherlands, posting on social media that Ukraine and thus the whole of Europe will be better protected from Russian terror. He said the deliveries are coming at a time when Russia is trying to scale up its strikes. We've been covering that recently. They definitely have been increasing their missile strikes, their drone strikes, all of that. This will definitely help protect the lives of our people. So they're trying to get, I think, the same kind of air defense systems that the Israelis were stockpiled in up until the Iran war, the 12-day war, which, of course, a lot of that stuff is manufactured by and in the United States. Germany said Friday it will deliver 2 more Patriot air defense systems to Ukraine in the coming days. It has agreed to the move after securing assurances that the U.S. will prioritize the delivery of new Patriots to Germany to backfill its stocks. These weapon systems are only made in the United States. As an organization, NATO provides only non-lethal assistance to Ukraine, like uniforms, tents, medical supplies, and logistics support. The 32-nation military alliance has mostly sought to protect NATO territory from possible Russian attack and avoid being dragged into a war against a nuclear power. But its support role has expanded since the United States President Trump took office in January, even as his administration insists that European allies must now take care of their own security and that of their war-ravaged neighbor. Trump has made no public promise of weapons or economic support for Ukraine. Trump said on the 20th of July that the U.S. is going to be sending now military equipment and other equipment to NATO, and they'll be doing what they want, but I guess it's for the most part working with Ukraine. Well, there you have it. So NATO is going to be stepping up their role in, providing equipment outside of uniforms and stuff like the non-lethal stuff to the Ukrainians. They're going to get most of that from the United States. Basically, the end result's going to be the same. The Ukrainians are going to continue to get, military equipment and munitions and all that stuff from the United States. Now it's just being filtered through NATO. I don't know if the political ramifications of that are better or worse than if the United States was just directly providing the stuff, which is what has been going on anyways. Now we're kind of dragging NATO into this as well, which could definitely, I know one of Putin's, his, I guess, validations for this is that NATO is going to, they're anti-Russian and they're going to, they want to start a war with them and they're going to gear up along their borders and all, basically the stuff they did to Ukraine. The Russians did to Ukraine. So that's kind of, I think, some of the psychological fear tactics that Putin uses to justify his war in Ukraine is that, NATO is expanding and stuff. So now that NATO is going to be providing all these weapons, what is that going to look like for Russia? Because they're not going to handle that well. And since this excuse has been used by Putin to increase their fighting and all that stuff in Ukraine before, you would think he's only going to escalate things further now that NATO is actually coordinating this stuff. One could easily assume, right? And speaking of Putin, let's see. Reuters did a nice long piece here. Exclusive, Putin doubts potency of Trump's ultimatum to end the war, according to some sources that these folks have. So Russian President Putin is unlikely to bow to sanctions ultimatum expiring this Friday from Donald Trump, and retains the goal of capturing 4 regions of Ukraine in their entirety, sources close to the Kremlin told Reuters. So there's 4 regions of Ukraine that Putin basically feels essentially are Russia, more or less, that he's trying to recapture for the Russian country. And unfortunately, it's the Ukraine, that's a different country. It's Ukraine. So that's essentially what's going on with this whole war here. Trump has threatened to hit Russia with new sanctions and impose 100% tariffs on countries that buy its oil, of which the biggest are China and India, unless Putin agrees to a ceasefire in Russia's war in Ukraine. Putin's determination to keep going is prompted by his belief that Russia is winning and by skepticism that yet more U.S. sanctions will have much of an impact after successive waves of economic penalties during the 3.5 years war, according to 3 sources familiar. And that's kind of what I was saying with this whole thing is what is left at this point? What is more sanctions going to do? Probably not much, right? The Russian leader does not want to anger Trump, and he realizes that he may be spurning a chance to improve relations with Washington in the West, but his war goals take precedence, 2 of the sources have said. There you go. Putin's goal is to fully capture the Ukrainian regions of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, which Russia has claimed as its own, and then to talk about a peace agreement, one of the sources said. So there's 4 regions, there's 4 oblasts in Ukraine that they think they are entitled to belonging to Russia. If Putin were able to fully occupy those 4 regions, which he has claimed for Russia, he could claim that his war in Ukraine has reached its objectives, says James Rogers, author of the forthcoming book, The Return of Russia. The current talk process, in which Russia and Ukrainian negotiators have met 3 times since May, was an attempt by Moscow to convince Trump that Putin was not rejecting peace, the first source said, adding that the talks were devoid of real substance apart from discussions on humanitarian exchanges. Now, I should zoom in a little here. Sorry about that. Russia says it is serious about agreeing a long-term peace in the negotiations, but that the process is complicated because the 2 sides' stances are so far apart. Putin last week described the talks as positive. Moscow's stated demands include a full Ukrainian withdrawal from the 4 regions and acceptance by Kyiv of neutral status and limits on the size of its military, demands that are all rejected by the Ukrainians. In a sign that there may yet be an opportunity to strike a deal before the deadline, Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, is expected to visit Russia this week, following an escalation in rhetoric between Trump and Moscow. That was with Medvedev. We talked about that yesterday. On Monday, Russia said it was no longer bound by a moratorium on short and medium-range nuclear missiles. The Kremlin did not respond to a request for comment for the story. All the sources spoke to Reuters on condition of anonymity because of the sensitivity of the situation. Trump, who in the past has praised Putin and held out the prospect of lucrative business deals between their two countries, has lately expressed growing impatience with the Russian president. He has complained about what he called Putin's bullshit and described Russia's relentless bombing of Kyiv and other Ukrainian cities as disgusting. The Kremlin has said it noted Trump's statements, but it has declined to respond to them. Sometimes the most effective response is no response, right? Damn. Ukrainian Prime Minister Serdenko said last week called on the world to respond with maximum pressure after the worst Russian airstrike of the year killed 31 in Kyiv, including 5 children, and what she called Russia's response to Trump's deadline. President Trump wants to stop the killing, which is why he's selling American-made weapons to NATO members and threatening Putin with biting tariffs and sanctions if he does not agree to a ceasefire, White House spokesman Anna Kelly said in response for a request for comment. The first source said Putin was privately concerned about the recent deterioration of U.S. ties. Putin still retains the hope that Russia can again befriend America and trade with the West, and he is worried, in quotes, about Trump's irritation, this person said. But with Moscow's forces advancing on the battlefield and Ukraine under heavy military pressure, Putin does not believe now is the time to end the war, the source said, adding that neither the Russian people nor the army would understand if he stops now. I mean, that kind of makes sense. Rogers, the author, said Putin has invested his political reputation and legacy into the war. Yes, he has. We know from his previous writings and statements that he sees himself as part of a strong tradition of standing up to the West and the rest of the world to defend Russia's interests. The Kremlin leader values the relationship with Trump and does not want to anger him, however. He simply has a top priority. Putin cannot afford to end the war just because Trump wants it, said a second Russian source. A third person familiar with Kremlin thinking also said Russia wanted to take all 4 regions, but did not see the logic in stopping at a time of battlefield gains during Russia's summer offensive. So in this area, once the fall hits and the winter's there, it's really hard to fight. And then, in the spring, it's rainy and it's all these fields turn to mud and stuff. So you have the summer and the fall basically to kind of do all your offensives in this part of the world. Ukraine has suffered some of the biggest territorial losses of 2025 in the past 3 months, including 502 square kilometers in July, according to Blackbird Group, a Finland-based military analysis center. In total, Russia has occupied around a fifth of Ukraine. Russia's military general staff has told Putin that the Ukrainian front will crumble in 2 or 3 months. Wow. However, Russia's recent gains remain relatively minor in pure territorial terms, with only 5,000 square kilometers of Ukraine taken since the start of the war, which is less than 1% of the country's overall territory, according to a June report. Okay. Ukrainian and Western military sources acknowledge that Russia is making gains, but only gradually and with heavy casualties. Russian war bloggers say Moscow's forces have been bogged down during its current summer offensive in areas where the terrain and dense urban landscape favored Ukraine, but assess that other areas should be faster to take. He's made the threats before. Trump's sanctions threat was painful and unpleasant, but not a catastrophe, the second source said. The third source says there was a feeling in Moscow that there's not much more that they can do to us, which is kind of what I've been wondering. I mean, what else is there? It was also not clear if Trump would follow through on his ultimatum, this person said, adding that he's made threats before and then not acted or changed his mind. I think as Americans, we all know that statement to be very true. The source also said it was hard to imagine that China would stop buying Russian oil on instructions from Trump and that his actions risked backfiring by driving oil prices higher. Yeah, I don't think China is going to change what they're doing. As a consequence of previous rounds of sanctions, Russian oil and gas exporters have taken big hits to their revenues, and foreign direct investment in the country fell by 63% last year, according to UN trade data. Around $300 billion of central bank assets have been frozen. All right. But Russia's ability to wage war has been unimpeded, thanks in part to ammunition supplies from North Korea and imports from China of dual-use components that have sustained a massive rise in military production. The Kremlin has repeatedly said that Russia has some immunity to sanctions. There you go. You can put sanctions on Russia, but it might not matter because one, they have so much territory and natural resources themselves, and then two, whatever they don't have, China probably does have, and that's their neighbor. Trump has acknowledged Russia's skill in skirting the measures. They're wily characters and they're pretty good at avoiding sanctions, so we'll see what happens, he told reporters at the weekend when asked what his response would be if Russia did not agree to a ceasefire. A first Russian source noted that Putin, in pursuing the conflict, was turning his back on a U.S. offer made in March that Washington, in return for his agreement to a full ceasefire, would remove U.S. sanctions, recognize Russian possession of Crimea, really, annexed from Ukraine in 2014, and acknowledge de facto Russian control of the territory captured by its forces since 2022. Wow, the United States offered that to Russia? We're going to acknowledge their possession of Crimea, which they took in 2014, and then acknowledge their control over territory, all the territory that they had captured since the start of this war on mainland Ukraine. That is interesting. I totally missed that. Apparently that was back in March. Wow. And they didn't take it. The source called the offer a fantastic chance, but said stopping a war was much more difficult than starting it. Ain't that the truth? Well, there you have it. Is anything going to change anytime soon in Ukraine? Probably not. Probably not. It doesn't seem like it. I mean, kind of was stressing that article, what are these August 8th deadlines actually going to do to Russia during a time where we're barely trading with them anyways? The United States, at least. I know, I think the United States ended up putting a little higher tariffs on India because they still been buying fuel from energy from Russia. But I don't know, that might pressure them to stop. But even if, I mean, I don't know if they buy enough that it's going to cripple Russia's, efforts to continue waging this war. So that's kind of one of the issues. Is Russia is a very large country with vast resources, and ultimately, if it came down to it, I think they would be able to just fund themselves and keep moving forward one way or another. It's kind of the Russian way, right? Right, but who knows? This will be interesting to see what happens at the end of the week. If Trump announces anything, or if it's, we'll see what happens. We'll talk to you next week about this, or, what's it going to be when the end of this week hits and this ceasefire is not agreed to. But we shall see. We're only a few short days away from that. So that is coming soon. All right, on to Sudan. Besieged city faces starvation. We briefly touched on this. Now, I found this article from the BBC, and it's got a bunch of links out to other articles, which is great because we'll find out a little more about this. I didn't get too deep into this yesterday. I was already kind of like about 2 hours into the stream, so that's about my max for this daily. The UN's food agency has warned that families trapped within the besieged Sudanese city of El Fasher face starvation. El Fasher, maybe. Not sure quite how to pronounce that. The World Food Program said it had not been able to deliver food to the city in the western Darfur region by road for more than a year. El Fasher has been surrounded by paramilitary fighters from the Rapid Support Forces for the last 16 months, determined to seize it from Sudan's army. WFP warning comes as local activists have already begun reporting deaths by starvation in the city, which is home to about 300,000 people. Sudan was plunged into a civil war in April 2023 after a vicious power struggle erupted between the army and its former ally, the RSF, creating one of the world's worst humanitarian cases. So the Sudanese army and the RSF were former allies, but now, since April of 2023. So this has been going on for a little over 2 years now. The UN Children's Agency, UNICEF, has also issued a statement saying malnutrition is rife across the country, with many children reduced to skin and bones. So here is a link for a simple guide to what is happening here. Let's see, when did this come out? The 4th of July. All right. Sudan plunged into civil war April 2023 after a vicious power struggle broke out between its army and a powerful paramilitary group, the Rapid Support Forces. It has led to famine and claims of genocide in the western Darfur region. More than 150,000 people have died in the conflict across the country, and about 12 million have fled their homes in what the United Nations has called the world's largest humanitarian crisis. Here's what you need to know. So Sudan is a Northeast Africa country. It's one of the largest countries on the continent, covering about 734,000 square miles or 2 million square kilometers. It borders 7 countries and the Red Sea. The River Nile flows through it, making it strategically important for foreign powers. Population of Sudan is predominantly Muslim, and the country's official languages are Arabic and English. Even before the war started, Sudan was one of the poorest countries in the world, despite the fact that it is a gold-producing nation. Interesting. So they've got gold in Sudan, but it's still one of the poorest countries. It's 46 million people were living on an average annual income of $750 a head. Annual income. So that's living on $2 a day. And that's the average person out of 46 million. Damn, that is sad. The conflict has made things much worse. Last year, Sudan's finance minister said state revenues had shrunk by 80%, of course. Civil war is always going to kill your economy. What triggered the conflict? The civil war is the latest episode in bouts of tension that followed the 2019 ousting of long-serving President Omar al-Bashir, who came to power in a coup in 1989. There were huge street protests calling for an end to his near 3-decade rule, and the army mounted a coup to get rid of him. But civilians continued to campaign for the introduction of democracy. Interesting. All right. So joint military-civilian government was then established, but that was overthrown by another coup in 2021. The coup was staged by 2 men at the center of the conflict. All right. So you got al-Burhan, the head of the armed forces, and essentially the country's president, and then his deputy, which is the RSF leader, General Dagalo, better known as Hemedti. Okay. But then General Burhan and General Dagalo disagreed on the direction the country was going in and proposed move towards civilian rule. Okay. So both of these guys are against democracy, essentially, is what that says. General Burhan and General Dagalo disagreed on the direction the country was going in and the proposed move towards civilian rule. So civilian rule, aka democracy. The main sticking points were plans to incorporate 100,000 strong RSF into the army and who would lead the new force. The suspicions were that both generals wanted to hang on to their positions of power, unwilling to lose their wealth and influence. Shooting between the two sides began on the 15th of April 2023, following days of tensions as members of the RSF were redeployed around the country in a move that the army saw as a threat. It is disputed who fired the first shot, but the fighting swiftly escalated, with the RSF seizing much of Khartoum until the army regained control of it almost 2 years later in March 2025. All right. So here's the RSF. They have like actual military uniforms and stuff. Interesting. Okay. The RSF was formed in 2013 and has its origins in the notorious Janjaweed militia that brutally fought rebels in Darfur, where they were accused of genocide and ethnic cleansing against the region's non-Arab population. Since then, General Dagalo has built a powerful force that has intervened in conflicts in Yemen and Libya. Interesting. He also controls some of Sudan's gold mines and allegedly smuggles the metal to the UAE. The army accuses the UAE of backing the RSF and carrying out drone strikes in Sudan. Interesting. So the UAE is involved in Sudanese affairs. Okay. The oil rich Gulf state denies this allegation. Well, they say that they're not involved, of course. The army also accuses Eastern Libyan strongman General Haftar of supporting the RSF by helping it to smuggle weapons into Sudan and sending fighters to bolster the RSF. Okay. In eastern June 2025, the RSF achieved a major victory when it took control of territory along Sudan's border with Libya and Egypt. The RSF also controls almost all of Darfur and much of neighboring Kordofan. It has declared plans to form a rival government, raising fears that Sudan could split for a second time. South Sudan seceded in 2011, taking with it most of that country's oil fields. Really? So South Sudan is where the oil is in Sudan, which, of course, is an entirely separate country now. South Sudan is the youngest country in the world currently. Now, if Palestine gets recognized, then Palestine would be the newest country in the world by about 14, 15 years, depending on if and when that happens. All right. Well, that puts some things into perspective there, okay? Because I didn't really know what was happening here. So it's a civil war between two warlords, one of which essentially is more or less the de facto president, and then the other which used to work for that guy, but he is the general of a paramilitary group, and they used to be allies, but neither of them wanted democracy, and then neither of them wanted to give up their power. So inevitably that led to clashes between the two. There you have it. The WFP warning echoes a recent appeal for urgent support from the North Darfur Governor Bakhit, who said the living situation in Al Fashur has become unbearable. Bakhit is aligned with Sudan's military-led government, which is trying to retain control of the city, its last foothold in Darfur. The RSF's battle to seize Al Fashur from the Sudanese army has intensified in recent months after the paramilitaries were driven out of the capital of Khartoum. I'm not sure how to say that. UN statistics in early July showed that 38% of children under the age of 5 in camps for internally displaced people within and near Al Fashur suffered from acute malnutrition. So that's 38% just that are living in the camps. Then there's the other children who they don't have the statistics for. So obviously, there's a lot of people really suffering here. And there, one article, it might have been this one or the other one, but it did say this is currently the largest humanitarian crisis in the world. Is this war in Sudan, even larger than the one in Gaza? Because in Gaza, ultimately, they do only have a population of 2 million people, whereas in South Sudan, it was something like, Sudan, it was something like 46 million. Sudan population. Well, now that they're saying 50 million here on Google. So they have extensively more people than in the Palestinian regions. So naturally, there's a lot more refugees, and they're a lot more spread out. All right. Everyone in Al Fashur is facing a daily struggle to survive. People's coping mechanisms have been completely exhausted by over 2 years of war. Without immediate and sustained access, lives will be lost. The agency quoted an 8-year-old girl who had fled the city with 5 members of her family. In Al Fashur, there was a lot of shelling and hunger, only hunger and bombs, the girl said, adding that the family had been surviving on only millet. I don't even know what that is. Millet. There you go. Looks like cereal crops or grain crops. Okay. So very basic food. Probably doesn't have much any calories or nutrients in it. You could reasonably assume just something to make you think that you get something in your belly, I guess. Let's see. The WFP said it had trucks loaded with food and nutrition assistance ready to go and had received clearance from the Sudanese government to proceed. It is still waiting for word from the RSF on whether it would support a pause in fighting to allow the goods into the city. So right now, the RSF has the city surrounded and blockaded and besieged, so no one can get into the city. So the UN is hoping that the RSF will let them in to try and help at least some of these civilians. The UN has been pushing for a week-long humanitarian truce since early June, when a UN convoy on the way to El Fasher was attacked, with the army and the RSF blaming each other for the strike. And I believe it said there was a aid worker was killed in that attack too. Sudan State News Agency reported that the head of the armed forces, General Al-Burnham, the country's de facto leader, had agreed to the temporary ceasefire. The RSF did not officially respond. However, reports quoting RSF advisors said that the group had rejected the initiative as it believed the truce would be used to facilitate the delivery of food and ammunition to Burhan's besieged militias inside Al Fasher. All right. They also claimed that the RSF and its allies were setting up safe routes for civilians to leave the city. So those are some advisors saying that. Last month, the International Organization for Migration said more than 1 million people had fled Al Fasher since the conflict began. Okay. Including those from the nearby Zamzam camp that was seized by the RSF in April. The BBC has heard firsthand accounts of their desperate flight from intensified bombings of Al Fasher and attacks by RSF allied gangs on the road. The WFP said it had made modest progress in delivering food assistance to some other parts of Darfur, but said those fragile gains risked being reversed when roads were closed by the coming rainy season. UNICEF Sudan representative Sheldon Yett also said some conditions were slowly improving in areas of central Sudan, which has recently become accessible to aid workers after the Sudanese army drove out RSF fighters. But he said resources were stretched to the limit because of recent funding cuts, apparently referring to U.S. Donald Trump administration's drastic decrease in international aid. It is a looming catastrophe, he said. We are on the verge of irreversible damage to an entire generation of children, not because we lack the knowledge or the tools to save them, but because we are collectively failing to act with the urgency and at the scale that this crisis demands. We need access to the children. So here's a map here. Let's see. Here's the Darfur region. So in blue, you got the RSF. In this kind of reddish color, you got the Sudanese army and the de facto president of Sudan, which is the general of that army. And then yellow, you've got other armed groups. So there's more parties involved in this too. All right. It looks like there's some yellow here around Al Fasher. So they've got army, they've got a surrounding by the RSF, and then they've got other forces there too, presumably helping against the RSF. All right. Well, that is another mess. They said this is the biggest humanitarian crisis right now in the world. So you probably got a bunch of people going into Chad. You got Egypt up here. I think, is this Libya maybe? Yeah, that is Libya up there to the northwest of Sudan. And then, of course, this section of Sudan broke off back in 2011 because these are non-Muslims mostly, and they were just they were suffering a genocide from Muslims in Sudan. So this part of the world has just been absolutely decimated by primarily religious wars, and then now it's a civil war. This isn't a religious war that they're having. The civil war, it's more two different army generals just can't get along. Neither one of them wants to step down and have less power and say that the other one's in charge, basically. So, yeah, that's what you have going on in Sudan. So I'm going to keep an eye on what's happening in El Fasher there. All right. Last but not least, we have Lebanon. So this is just a quick political article, and then we'll wrap up for the day. Lebanon's cabinet meets to discuss Hezbollah's arms after U.S. pressure. So, the U.S. has been pressuring the government of Lebanon to disarm Hezbollah and get them out of the country. Lebanon's cabinet will meet on Tuesday to discuss Hezbollah's arsenal after Washington ramped up pressure on ministers to publicly commit to disarming the Iran-backed group, and amid fears Israel could intensify strikes if they failed to do so. So right now, what's going on in Lebanon is basically there's been a ceasefire. All of Hezbollah has left more or less this river. I think they're allowed to be north. Yeah, this Litani River. So, or no. Was it that river or was it a different one? Because I remember this was actually north of. There's some river that cuts it. It's probably this river. Here. Okay, right here is this river. And this southern section of Lebanon now is presumably Hezbollah free, and then Hezbollah is still existing to an extent up on the northern section of the country. The session, scheduled for 3 p.m. at Lebanon's presidential palace, is the first time that the cabinet will discuss the fate of Hezbollah's weapons, unimaginable when the group was at the zenith of its power just 2 years ago. So this was one war that Israel more or less was able to get over fairly quickly, primarily just through airstrikes as well. Pressure from the U.S. and Hezbollah's domestic rivals for the group to relinquish its arms has spiked following last year's war with Israel, which killed Hezbollah's top leaders and thousands of fighters and destroyed much of its rocket arsenal. In June, U.S. envoy Thomas Barak proposed a roadmap to Lebanese officials to fully disarm Hezbollah in exchange for Israel halting its strikes on Lebanon and withdrawing its troops from 5 points they still occupy in southern Lebanon. There you go. So if the government can disarm Hezbollah, then Israel is going to stop their strikes in Lebanon, and they're going to withdraw some of their troops. They've got in 5 different areas here around the border. The Israelis have troops. So presumably it would be somewhere along this stretch in 5 areas where they're kind of more or less occupying parts of southern Lebanon. The proposal included a condition that Lebanon's government pass a cabinet decision clearly pledging to disarm Hezbollah. So that's kind of the conditions. After Barak made several trips to Lebanon to urge progress on the plan, Washington's patience began wearing thin, Reuters reported last week. It pressured Lebanon's ministers to swiftly make the public pledge so that talks could continue. But Lebanese officials and diplomats say such an explicit vow could spark communal tensions in Lebanon, where Hezbollah and its arsenal retain significant support among the country's Shiite Muslim community. So that's one of the worries here. Hezbollah is radical Shiites. Lebanon is predominantly a Shiite Muslim community. So there are going to be citizens in Lebanon that back Hezbollah against the Israelis because most of Shiite Muslims are pretty well opposed to the existence of Israel. Proposed wording. On Monday evening, a group of dozens of motorcycles set out from a neighborhood in Beirut's suburbs where Hezbollah has strong support, carrying the party's flag. Well, there you go. That's what I basically just said. So they got motorcycle gangs promoting Hezbollah in Beirut, the capital of Lebanon. Hezbollah's main ally, Lebanese parliament speaker Nabi Berri, has been in talks with President Joseph Aoun and Prime Minister Salem ahead of Tuesday's session to agree on a general phrase to include in a cabinet decision to appease the U.S. and buy Lebanon more time. More time for what? Exactly. Berry's proposed wording would commit Lebanon to forming a national defense strategy and maintaining a ceasefire with Israel, but would avoid an explicit pledge to disarm Hezbollah across Lebanon. Well, then they're probably not going to get Israel to leave those positions and stop the bombings, right? But other Lebanese ministers plan to propose a formulation that commits Lebanon to a deadline to disarm Hezbollah. All right, so you have a bit of a schism within the government of Lebanon on what to do with Hezbollah, which is good because, as you know, much like Hamas in Palestine, as long as Hezbollah is around, the Israelis are always going to feel threatened. Because, you know, again, these are Iranian-backed groups and their existence is predicated on the destruction of Israel. It's, you know, kind of their purpose. There's frankly no need to kick the can down the road and postpone a decision. We have put Lebanon's interests first and take a decision today, Shahidi told Reuters. Interesting. Lebanese officials and foreign envoys say Lebanese leaders fear that a failure to issue a clear decision on Tuesday could prompt Israel to escalate its strikes, including on Beirut. A U.S. brokered ceasefire last November ended the conflict between Hezbollah and Israel, though Israel has continued to carry out strikes on what it says are Hezbollah armed depots and fighters, mostly in the southern portion of Lebanon. All right, so Lebanon's still a hotbed. There's still missile strikes going on from Israel almost daily. I don't think it's nearly on the scale that Gaza is right now, but it's another part of the world there in the Middle East, right around, you know, bordering nations with Israel that, you know, things could erupt very quickly. So be keeping an eye on that as well. All righty. Well, that is it for today. I appreciate everyone for tuning in. Hope everyone has a lovely Tuesday. We'll be back tomorrow. We'll see if we get any new news on what's going to happen with Gaza and the Israeli IDF plan for this presumed full-on occupation. We'll see what happens as this week unfolds with the U.S. and Russian relations. And we'll keep an eye on these other countries, especially Sudan. You know, that's the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world, and virtually nobody is talking about it. So it's one thing that I've noticed for a long time about the media. You know, whether you're talking in Europe or over here in the States, we just don't talk about Africa much. You know, we just don't talk about Africa much. So we talk about the Middle East all the time. Don't talk about Africa much. So I definitely want to focus, or not necessarily focus and make it the main point of the, you know, of the broadcast, but definitely keep up on what's happening in Sudan. But thank you, everyone. I will be back again tomorrow. Y'all have a lovely day.